Moore here to say a few words on his philosophy and approach for mentorship, and former CGS president and faculty member at Queen's University. So yeah, thanks for joining, Ian.
You're very welcome. It's lovely to be asked to make this presentation. First of all, big congrats for this program. I think it's an incredible initiative. I think it's something that I didn't think of when we set up the YP committee, but it was the first new initiative that came out of your committee. And it just blew me away. It's such a great idea. It will involve significant investments from people, but I think the returns are going to be huge. So huge congrats to everybody who's been involved in setting this up and coming up with the idea in the first place. So let's move on to the next slide. So I believe I've been asked to give this talk because in my role as a professor and as a person who's been involved in the industry for a fair while, I do get involved in mentoring. I'll be starting off and just explaining that I'll be describing how I do it, and specifically the kind of circumstances which guide my mentoring activities. So I'm going to start with a little bit of that story. So just a little bit of the history of how my involvement in. So just go back if that's all right, mate. I'll do the introduction slide. Thanks. A bit of the history. Then I want to talk a little bit about my philosophy, some practical approaches, and a conclusion. And one of the reasons I like this slide here, which it's one of my favorites, all-time favorite slides of me with the team, is that there's a number of people in this slide that have mentored me. There's two of the people are actually from the contractor who was helping us with this project, but the other three of the other four people, I'm one of them, and three of people who've I've mentored. And it's almost the best part of my job. I can't think of anything that I enjoy more. It's collaborating with people and mentoring people, but also being mentored, because these people teach me a lot as well. Just this week, for example, one of the people that I formally mentor, I was asking her advice on something that I needed her input on. So yeah, it's a really fun part of the job, and I hope that you all enjoy it as much as I do. Next slide, thanks, mate. So I don't know, it's something that happens without a formal program. And I found myself, as I started my doctoral studies at Sydney University, before long, I was talking to other graduate students and some undergraduates and providing advice, just as we all do, right? I'm sure everybody here is in the same position, where we get advice from people when we start out in a new job, and then before long, we're giving advice. And there's something wonderful about giving advice, because it actually forces you to think through things yourself in a way that you don't necessarily do when it's just sort of your own decision making for yourself. My second, point in the career that I'm describing here, I was at the University of Newcastle. There were very few graduate students. I was a junior faculty member, and I didn't really have a lot of opportunities to interact with people and do mentoring. And that could well be one of the reasons why I didn't stay at the University of Newcastle. I was there for 7 years and moved on to North America. There's a lot of things of appeal here in Canada that attracted me to move from Australia to Canada. But certainly one of them is just the way graduate students, the sort of culture of having graduate students and getting graduate training. And so then I had 11 years at the University of Western Ontario, which I didn't actually mention the institution here. That's very wrong of me. So I should have put Western. I'm not trying to hide my affiliation with Western. They were great years. And I also had 4 years as Associate Dean Research and Graduate Studies. And so I was not only mentoring my graduate students, but this is when I started mentoring colleagues. So essentially, young colleagues who are coming into the system, helping them get research grants, figure out how to get graduate students. Some of the tricks that I'd learned about, well, not really tricks, but methods I've used to connect with industry and listen to industry and develop research partnerships with industry. And then since 2001, I've been at Queen's. The last 4.5 years, or a bit over 4.5 years, I've been head of department, and I've had lots of wonderful opportunities to mentor graduate students and, again, colleagues, and be mentored in my turn. And of course, lots of other interactions with people at conferences and so on, and in the CGS in particular. Next slide, thanks. So the reason I wanted to just go over that is that my context as a professor is maybe different to everybody else in on this call, because I heard that this first phase of the mentoring program for the YP committee specifically does not include academia. And so some of what my experience and things that I might have to say might be sort of very relevant to my context and maybe not yours. So use or ignore as you see fit. So what's my philosophy? Well, try to be positive and supportive. This is something that I've had to learn to do. I'm sort of naturally a fairly critical person, and of course, we train in academic graduate studies to be critical. Like, that's part of the training, is that critical assessment of things, and it's very easy to move that over to critical assessment of people. But it's good to be positive and supportive, and part of being a good mentor is being a listener. So it's not just the mentees that need to be listeners, but the mentors need to be listeners. Also, I think, and this is where I'm definitely not claiming to be a great success, but at least try to be a good role model, because that's almost the most potent form, most authentic form of mentoring is do as I do, not what I say, sort of thing. So, and I've already pointed out a number of times that also be a mentee. And I love the relationships that one develops in one's profession, and the opportunity to seek advice and give perhaps more junior colleagues a chance to be mentors and get the experience of being on that other side. My philosophy always is to provide advice and guidance, particularly options, but not give directions to people. So I do not make decisions for mentees. Sometimes the people that I mentor really want me to tell them what to do, and they really push me to try and tell them, well, what should I do? And I kind of refuse to tell them what to do. So David, did you have a question, mate?
Yes, a question/comment. In this area, I agree with absolutely everything you said. The one thing that I might add in here is that, particularly in the idea of not providing direction, is try not to be too definitive. I find that if you end up having a conclusion, it may be because you stop thinking. And I think one of the things I would add to here is if you can, as a mentor, ask questions of your mentee so that they try and do the thinking rather than you doing the thinking and telling them what the results are. It's the same story, but it's just the one thing: ask questions.
I love it. Thanks, mate. There's the voice of experience. I think that as you ask questions rather than make statements, you really get to the bottom of where people are coming from. And so that's really good advice. One of the reasons that I don't make decisions for people is I don't want to be responsible for those decisions, right? And if, let's say, if I was to tell people, oh, you shouldn't take that job, you should take that job, and then they hate it, well, I don't want to be responsible for that, nor should I be, right? Because it's really their decision. So, yeah, so I try and sort of discuss the pros and cons. And, let's say there's a two different sorts of jobs in different sorts of communities. I also, that's a great approach, David, where you ask questions. Well, what do you think about living in this place? And so on and so forth. Yep, that's great. Next slide, thanks. So, practical approaches. Now, I like these pictures that I've got here because I don't know if you can tell that they're both pictures of me at conferences. And both of these pictures were actually put on conference websites. And I just happened to see them, or somebody said, "Hey, Ian, your picture's on the website." So I grabbed them off the websites and I've sort of kept them. But actually, I love these shots because it's a reflective of the sort of the more casual opportunities one has for doing mentorship and having discussions with people and connecting with people. One of the challenges we have, all of us have, is that we're super, super busy. And so one of the difficulties is to try to be available. So what I try to do, and I'm sure I'm just stating the obvious, and many of us are doing the same thing. But when somebody needs advice, it's better to give them advice and make an appointment within a day or so than to, of course, leave them waiting a couple of weeks. So I try to give the people that I have that relationship with a high priority, and so on. Now, the other thing I try to do is to try and make time for a sort of more casual conversation, or what I've called here a chat, rather than the sort of regular meetings we have. So I meet with every graduate student every week, but we've got so much to discuss in the time that's set aside. We don't really have time to chat about, or for me to answer sort of more general questions. I often end up doing that at the end of my meetings anyway, but it's really great to set aside some time to have a coffee or just have a sort of more casual discussion, and that often produces more potent interactions when it comes to sort of giving people sort of career advice and so on. I've just made a comment here about other opportunities. So next slide, thanks. Now, part of my philosophy, so I'm going back to philosophy here, is to explain not what, but also why. So people will say, well, so again, this is my context as a professor advising my graduate students, but like, where should we publish this paper? Well, I'll sort of explain, all right. I'll say, well, here's a couple of journals. Here are the pros and cons of those journals. Why would we send it to this one? Why wouldn't we send it to that one? Basically, flesh out not just a simple answer, but flesh out the underlying things that you can consider when you make a decision like that. So with journals, it's what's the goal of the journal? What's the character on the nature of the particular audience? How often should we use that journal? What sort of paper should be sent to that journal, and so on. Or again, going to conferences. There's so many conferences, like which one to attend. Why would we attend one specific conference rather than another? Should I be going to lots of conferences or just a few more often, and so on. And so just discuss the why, not just the what. Next slide, thanks. With my colleagues, my young colleagues, as head of department, I have a policy where I meet with every assistant professor in the department every 4 to 6 to 8 weeks, depending on who that person is, where they are in their career. And also, one of my assistant professor colleagues is less dependent on me as a head because he's got other people who provide great advice to him. So I might just meet with him once every term. So the reason I schedule a meeting is, of course, because we're all so busy. And if you don't schedule things, it doesn't tend to happen. So that's just something practical that I do. Another thing that I do is our discussions are typically a combination of what it is that they're interested to get to discuss at a given time. So I'll typically start each meeting by saying, what do you want to, is there anything you need to discuss today? But I also have a list of topics that I try to work through in the first couple of years of their faculty position on a bunch of topics, which again, most of which may not be relevant to folks in industry. But the point I'm making in here is that I've sat down and over the space of, I guess, 2 or 3 years, created a list of topics that I think are important and valuable for those people. And the idea, of course, is to ensure that I don't forget anything for a specific individual and to sort of have some sort of orderly approach. And of course, this is what we as engineers do. I don't think there's any genius involved here. It's just how I do it. And I think anybody else who was in the same position would probably end up doing the same thing. But having that list really helps me because we start with those open questions like what do you need to discuss? And then once that's covered, then I say, well, I don't think we've discussed X, and then we'll have a discussion about that. Next slide, thanks. Another thing that I do in terms of mentoring is to include my colleagues and my students in my professional activities. So they see models that they can learn from. So for example, I have meetings with my research partners. So for example, I had a meeting last Monday, not this week, but the previous week. So I'm sort of wrapping up the last big grant and I'm preparing for the next big grant. And I invited all my students to come along. Not just the students who actually are working on that project, but other students so they can see it, to see what the interactions are, to meet those people. Surprisingly, 2 of my students decided they didn't have time or inclination to come, which I was a bit amazed by because I thought it would have been a great opportunity for them, but I didn't tell them off or indicate that I thought they were making a bad choice. I might have raised my eyebrows, but anyway, create opportunities. I'm not forcing people to do anything. I also try and include them as co-applicants on grants and contracts, as collaborators on projects and so on. So for my young colleagues who may not even be in the same area of research like geotechnique as I'll think about, is there some sort of project we could do together just so that we've had the opportunity to work together, and maybe that could be of benefit to them and probably it'll be of benefit to me as well. I also have a comment here about social professional activity. I do tend to keep my home life and my work life separate. And that's perhaps not something that's as important when you're in industry, but here at the university, that can be, I think, quite important. So no linking with people on Facebook and so on, because I think everybody has a different philosophy about that, but my philosophy is to keep those things separate. But what I'm talking about is social professional. In other words, I'm not necessarily inviting them home for coffee, but I'm creating an opportunity so it's not just around the project. It's going and so that we have an opportunity to do something during working hours in a safe environment, but where we can have a discussion about things more broadly. David, you've got another suggestion, mate. David?
Yes, sir. Yes, I'm just trying to find the mute button.
Yes, I know the problem.
I think you were implying just a moment ago that there is benefit to both parties here. And I think that's something that I would certainly stress, that this is not a mentor-mentee one-way directional relationship. It certainly is a two-way relationship, because if as a mentor you are not gaining something from it, then why are you doing it? I mean, you're trying to do it for the benefit of the mentee, obviously. But in my mind, one of these sorts of things is really, really key, is that you have to find the right way to get something out of it yourself as a mentor, so that you are being able to be very actively involved rather than just sort of more passively involved. I think that fills in a little bit more than what you were saying.
Yes, thanks very much, mate. I think it's well said, well added. So everybody has a different approach to how they integrate their personal life with their professional life. But as I said, as a university professor, you know, my relationship with my graduate students is a bit more like my colleagues, but it's still not the same. But I certainly keep undergraduate students at a reasonable distance in terms of my personal life. Next slide, thanks. Yeah, so anyway, that's pretty much it from me. I think whether as a mentor or a mentee, it's just a super rewarding activity. The relationships that you develop during those discussions and interactions often last for years and years. And I just think this initiative, such a great fit within the context of a learned society, particularly one like the Canadian Geotechnical Society. I do think that investing in people and setting them up for success takes time, but it's likely the best part of my job as a professor, and I expect that it's just as positive for people in industry. So I hope that's been helpful. I don't think there's any sort of huge words of wisdom, but it's just where I'm coming from. And yeah, and I'll just reiterate just what a great initiative this is. Thanks very much. Unless there's questions, I'll mute myself and we'll proceed.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ian. That was really great to hear and get some words of wisdom from a professional like yourself, Bill, and that was great. Yeah, we do have a brief question period coming up here shortly at the end. So yeah, if anybody has any questions for anyone or anything for Intercer or myself or Ian or Rob, then yeah,